What liberals call populism is the political backlash against the social disruption produced by their policies, which liberals don't understand. Where did it come from? The devil? Was it just solely whipped up by a few demagogues? There were large enough sections of society that did not want and even feared and dreaded a continuation of the status quo. So they were willing to take a gamble on Brexit, on Trump. It was a sufficiently radical upheaval to let their voices be heard and for something or other to happen.
John Gray, hello. How are you?
Hello, Ollie. Very glad to be here.
Good. Very glad to have you here. And welcome to Joe Towers. Before those unfamiliar with your work, I'm not sure who they are, but if they are, could you introduce yourself? Tell us who you are in your own words.
Well, for 30 years, I was a professional academic, historian of ideas, political theorist and philosopher. Then in 2007, 15 years ago, I left to take voluntary early retirement in order to be a full-time writer, and shifted, I think, from being an academic writer to being a voice, simply one voice among other voices. And I prefer that because if you are still a professor, and I enjoyed my time in academic life, particularly the contact with students and so on, but if you're an academic, then it seems as if you speak from a kind of position of authority, which I think is often not merited. So I prefer to be a voice among other voices, which people can listen to if they wish to listen to, and if they find it interesting and learn something from it, I'm very happy. But I don't want what I'm saying to be taken as any kind of authoritative judgment.
Very good. And your voice has turned back to Hobbes,
yes,
to the Leviathans, to the state
yes.
of nature, with this new book, The New Leviathans.
Yes.
Why? Why have you gone back to Hobbes?
Well, he was one of the first, if not the first, political philosopher that I read back in the 1960s. And at that time, the first thing that impressed me about him was his prose style. He has a very clear, stark English prose style. In fact, it's the first big work of Leviathan, Hobbes' Leviathan of philosophy in English. And it's a very aphoristic, tough style, which expresses stark, as I've said, a kind of stark, lapidary style, which partly reflects his tone of mind, which is that he wanted to sweep away everything that was superfluous, which for him included the entire philosophy of the ancient Greeks and Romans, and also the medieval philosophers. He thought they were all misleading because they treated concepts or words, he would even say, as if they were realities when they were human constructions, and couldn't ever fully capture a highly fluid and sometimes contradictory reality. So he wanted to sweep all that away and, as it were, start from scratch. And that's what he tried to do in Leviathan and in his other writings. Leviathan is the best known. It's the most notorious. Copies of it were burned in front of the Bodleian Library in Oxford. He was threatened with charges of blasphemy and atheism at a time when that could be fatal. And during the Civil War, the English Civil War in the mid-17th century, he fled the country, went to Europe, met various people, famous astronomers, philosophers, and politicians. But he was there for his own safety, he believed, and I think his fears for his life were not ill-founded. He could easily have suffered in a bad way. So why go back to Hobbes now? Well, I say he was the first first great political philosophy I came across. And I was impressed then, as I say, by what he tried to be, which was a realist. And he thought that the default condition of human society wasn't harmony, it wasn't peace, it was conflict. And I think he's right about that. I think it's easy to fall into a state of nature. And the state of nature here, by the way, as I'm sure you realize, and many of your watchers might already understand, but I'll gloss it anyway, isn't a state before there is society. It isn't a prehistoric condition in which there was no society. The state of nature is a condition of anarchy or general conflict into which any society can fall at almost any time. And it can have various causes. In his day, it was a civil war. There were wars of religion as well. Religion and politics were tangled up, as they are now again, in various parts of the world. And he was writing for that. He'd experienced in his own life, he'd fled the country, he was writing for that. And he was attempting to come up with a solution to those kinds of conflicts, a prescription for peace, a way of achieving a project of peace, which used the very minimum of morality and the very minimum of assumptions. And for him, the chief one was self-preservation. He thought that if you stripped everything else out, what people wanted most was self-preservation. He allowed, there were other motives. He said people cared a lot for their reputation. He said here and there they'll give up their lives for trifles, like reputation. He thought that humans compared themselves to each other. They were what's later been called mimetic creatures. They copy each other and compare themselves with each other. So he didn't say self-preservation was the only human motive, but it was a very dominant one, and he thought it was strong enough to enable human beings to create out of the chaos, out of the anarchy in which they could slip, a sovereign, or as he called it, a Leviathan, that would bring peace. And they would have a kind of covenant or contract. Now, even then, all those years ago, back in the 1960s, early 70s, when I was reading Hobbes, I thought that was unrealistic. For various reasons, some of which I talk about in the book. One is if human beings are really so mistrustful of each other and so afraid of each other. One point that's worth mentioning is that although some people represent Hobbes as saying that the pursuit of power is the chief human motive, it isn't true for him. For Hobbes, people pursue power because they're afraid of one another. The dominant human passion in Hobbes's theory is fear, not power.
Well, let's talk about that in a little bit more detail then, John,
yes.
Because over the course of this conversation, I'd like to focus both on the failures of liberalism internationally
yes.
and also domestically.
Yes.
And seeing as we're talking about peace, obviously one of the most sort of famous proponents of that idea on the international scene is probably Francis Fukuyama and the end of history in the 1990s. The Soviet bloc falls, we're going to live in this peaceful, harmonious, liberal society. Obviously it didn't quite turn out to be true. Did it? Why?
No.
Why isn't it true?
Well, I think I can explain partly at least what happened and why there were the illusions there were then. And I can do that partly by an anecdote. I was in Washington on and off in 1989, 1990, around about that time, 91, when the Soviet Union collapsed. And Fukuyama's original essay had come out in a periodical in the spring of 89, in other words, before the war went down. But it was clear that Soviet communism was imploding. And I think it summarized very well an impression which was not only Fukuyama's, but which is quite common by then in America, particularly in Washington, which was that they'd won, the West, democratic capitalism had won, and against Soviet communism, and therefore they thought would continue winning and would be the only legitimate political system in the world. Now, there's been a lot of revisionism, including by Fukuyama himself. He's a very pleasant man. I know him. I've debated and talked to them many times in subsequent years. But revisionism, I never said that there'd be no big conflict. I never said that. I never said, well, I can tell you, having been around at the time, it was all taken very seriously. In Washington, some of the big foundations which had been giving grants to for foreign policy work stopped the grants. Don't need it anymore. Don't need it.
History's over.
It's all over. Now, he now says that what he meant by that was not that history was over in the everyday sense. And I think he said it was capital letter history. His history is a succession of big ideas. And the big idea that had won out in the Cold War was what he called democratic capitalism. Now, my criticism of that was not retrospective. I published a piece in October 1989. In other words, his article appeared in August 1989, in saying this is not the end of history. It could be the end of liberalism. What it is the resumption of history on rather traditional lines. What will happen from now on is that all the conflicts that were frozen in the Cold War, both within the Soviet Union and elsewhere, will become live as the Soviet Union vanishes. And there will be conflicts, mostly, maybe using new technologies, but of a very traditional kind. There'll be conflicts over resources. There'll be conflicts of a religious kind between different religious groups, sectarian groups. There'll be ethnic conflicts. There'll be, so to speak, quasi-imperial conflicts. That's what will happen. And that was considered, it was a very funny time for me, very entertaining in some ways, because that was considered apocalyptically pessimistic. In other words, when I said history will go on as before, as usual, as normal, apocalypse. So in other words, the baseline of the people, and nearly everyone said this, conservatives, liberals, social democrats, early Blairites, they all said it. Apocalyptic paganism, not going to be anything like that. Their baseline was that everything's going to be completely different. By the way, one person may not be familiar to many of your readers except as a name. One person didn't say that. Margaret Thatcher, when she was told about Fukuyama's ideas, at the end of history, the beginning of nonsense. She never swallowed it. For all her many errors and faults, she thought that history would just go on. Although she too came to think of Thatcherism, which I think was a product of domestic political conflicts in Britain, as a sort of universal prescription. So she fell almost into the Fukuyama's camp. It had worked, she thought, mistakenly, in Britain, so it could work everywhere. So, but to go back to your question, Ollie, why didn't it work like? Well, one reason was all these conflicts that had been suppressed came out. And the other was that the Cold War itself was extremely anomalous. The Cold War was, in ideological terms, a conflict between two Enlightenment ideologies, liberalism and communism lost out in that conflict. But historically, there are only a small range of the political ideas, a very small range, that have been fighting among themselves for primacy and for legitimacy. Very countless types of nationalism, anarchism, environmentalist ideologies, even in the 19th and 20th century, fascism. Also, a wide range of ideologies have always existed in the world, and I thought that would become again. So to think that this binary conflict, if you remove one of the elements of the binary conflict, communism, then the idea that remains was sweep everything before was a complete mistake. The trouble was, as is often the case, I thought that insight would spread after 1989, 1990, 1991. It didn't. What happened instead was that the idea then became, well, if history stopped, or it's stopping, we'll accelerate the stoppage. Because there seem to be some parts of the world are lagging, stuck in dictatorship or tyranny. They won't accept democratic capitalism. So we'll accelerate the end of history. And that was, in ideological terms, the background for the Iraq War. It wasn't the only reason the Iraq War happened, but without this neoconservative ideology, I don't think, I was in Washington in the run-up to the Iraq War more than once. And I think the neoconservatives prepared the ground in terms of public opinion and in terms of intellectually for the Iraq War. They said, this model, the model of democratic capitalism, the American model, essentially an American version of it, is spreading universally, and it'll spread all over the Middle East. And but we can trigger that by toppling Saddam and installing a version of this model. Now, what they failed to grasp there was a Hobbesian point, which is that and I made this before the invasion in March 23. I made this in February 23 in a New Statesman, which is that if you topple a tyrant, a leader, a despot, which Saddam was, who's been there for a long time and who's constructed around himself a whole regime. If you topple the regime, there's a great risk of destroying the state, because the state and the regime have become one side. The risk of doing this, they hadn't even landed yet, the Americans, but the risk of doing this is that the state of Iraq will break up. And that happened because the Kurds split off, ISIS came into being, The Yazidi people were subject to genocidal attacks. Women were raped and sexually enslaved. Gay men were burnt alive in cages. All kinds of truly horrifying things happened, even worse than what had happened under Saddam's tyranny. So the Hobbesian point there, which is a very hard point, hard for many people to accept, is that a tyranny can be less harmful in human terms than anarchy. And that's a kind of point which in the 20th century was hard to understand, because the greatest crimes of the 20th century, the Holocaust, the Soviet gulags, Pol Pot, and China's repressions, were all done by states, by very strong states. So liberals thought the state is the enemy. We've got to, not that we can do without a state, we've got to limit it, we've got to count rights, we've got to have huge systems of law to confine it as narrowly as possible to its, it can do things like welfare, but it's all got to be confined within a straitjacket of law to avoid these terrible crimes of states. And I think that was reasonable in the 20th century, but we're now almost a quarter of the way through the 21st century. And in the 21st century, we have the evidence of Iraq, what happened in Iraq. And then later on, after everyone said after Iraq, immediately after Iraq, we'll never do this again, they went and did it. In Libya, that wasn't mainly the Americans. They went along with it, but it was mainly David Cameron in this country, and the French who wanted to do this. And it was almost obvious that the same result would happen there. In fact, it's been almost worse, because the state of anarchy in which Libya was plunged after the toppling of Gaddafi continued, and for a long while there was no government. Now there are two, at least two, and people smuggling and organized human trafficking uses this vacuum of power as a base. And so, by the way, when you hear British or other Western leaders say, well, the solution is to lock up the people smugglers, okay, but there's no state in Libya. At least two governments. Who's going to do the locking up? How's it going to work? There's nothing there whereby you can do it. And the West, in particular the British and the French, created this vacuum. So nothing was learned. The basic Hobbesian lesson was not learned. And I think even now, so I say I'm usually over-optimistic, contrary to what people say about me, is I thought the lesson really hasn't been learned, even now.
To what extent can we view those choices as tragedy, as tragic decisions? You know, the tragic view accepts that there are irresolvable dilemmas. Either you accept Saddam's continued tyranny, the torture of the Kurds, etc., or you depose him and you have the chaos and anarchy of ISIS and the power vacuum. You know, if not on the basis of liberal internationalism, which we've outlined, to take another example from the 21st century, how should we, Western decision makers, policy makers, be reacting and viewing the invasion of Ukraine? Tragically, is it a tragic choice at
I think that is a tragic choice. I mean, even more than the other ones, because in the case of Ukraine, the West has to choose. And one of the features of tragic choices is that they're unchosen. The most deeply tragic choices are the ones we can't avoid making. Tragedy is more, in politics and in ethics, is more than the fact that human beings are imperfect. It's more than the fact that progress is always reversible. Tragedy in ethics and politics is a recurring encounter with options in which whatever you do, there are irreparable losses and even wrongs. That's tragedy. And I think Ukraine's like that. The earlier ones, I'm not sure were tragic, really weren't tragic. They were folly. Didn't have to invade. Didn't have to do anything. I mean, admittedly, there was terrible things were going on in Iraq and in Libya. But you didn't have to do anything. Whereas in the case of Ukraine, that was, I still think, an act of aggression by Putin. I know there are theories in which he was responding to the expansion of NATO and so on, but if you actually look at his own rhetoric, and even in a 5,000-word essay he penned at one point, he, more than talking about that, he was talking about recreating a Russian realm, which was much bigger than Russia had become after the collapse of communism. So I don't think the argument that it was all or primarily a result to Western expansion really holds. So it was an act of aggression, and also and this is partly what makes it tragic. It rapidly acquired, if it didn't have right from the start, it may have done, I would say almost genocidal tones, because they were talking about there was no such thing as a Ukrainian culture, or if there was, it had to be eliminated and replaced. That's a genocidal project. So it started as a crime, a major crime, the Ukraine situation, then became a tragedy in the sense that it was necessary to resist this, and so the terrible loss of lives, the destruction of cities going on in the country alongside Russian barbarism. I mean, meaning by that torture, deportation, abduction of children, all these terrible echoes of the Second World War and before have come back, along with trench warfare, have come back. So it became a tragic conflict. The risk now is that it goes on from being tragic to becoming an absurdity, because I don't think it's become clear that once Putin realized his disastrous error, he thought he could do it in 3 days. And by the way, some Western intelligence agencies said the same. They said he'll have, some Western observers say he'll be in Kiev in 3 or 4 days or a week, and
that's what they were talking about, extracting Zelensky, right? Because they didn't think.
Unfortunately, I mean, he didn't go. He didn't go, and he refused to go. I don't need transport, he said. I need weapons, and so they've carried on fighting. And I think that was heroic and tragic, because when Putin absorbed the fact that he made a disastrous error, he didn't back off. Mm. You know, there's a story, I think it's perhaps well sourced, that when he was growing up as a poor child in a family that had survived the Leningrad siege in the Second World War, in semi-bombed out part of it, that way he learned how to fight rats. He learned how to physically fight rats. He said, but don't put rats into a corner, they'll jump at your throat. So he's a tough guy in every way. So he may also, be cruel and various other, but he's tough, and so he didn't then give up. What he did actually was to learn from experience and start to take the long view. If he could keep at it long enough, if he could pour enough human Russian young men into the meat grinder, and of course he's got more of them than the West has, more than Ukraine. If he keeps pouring them in and just continues to do that, Western unity around supporting Ukraine, and even European unity, will fracture. And that has started to happen. And it's clear now in conflicts between Poland and Ukraine. It's clear in doubts, more than doubts. The top 3 contenders for the Republican nomination in the United States are all Ukraine skeptics. One or other of those 3 is going to win. It might or might not be Trump. It might be Trump. And whatever's going to happen, if then the Republicans win the election, the presidential election, then it's all over. Mm. It'll only be a matter of whether it's a naked deal with Putin, as Trump wants, or something more protracted. But basically, it's all over, because the Ukrainians are heavily dependent on American support in many ways. So the question now is if the sort of program of the West reflects the Ukrainian demand for a restoration of full sovereignty, including a retaking of Crimea, then you're moving beyond tragedy into something even worse, which is absurdity, because there's no way that the retaking of Crimea is going to happen. I mean, even it's forgotten now that even Gorbachev endorsed that annexation. I think any Russian leader regarded even a post-Putin leader, would not yield on that point. It would be, I mean, it's predominantly Russian area. They regarded its having become part of Ukraine in the first place as a catastrophe, as an error. So if Western policy sort of mirrors the Ukrainian policy, I think it's actually an unachievable goal they're looking at. If, on the other hand, it deviates from it, then you're back into tragedy. You're back into tragedy because the risk, I guess, and I'm sure this is fully understood in the Ukrainian leadership, the risk is that the West will do a deal over the heads of the Ukraine. They say they won't, they say they'll never do that, but that means they've been thinking about it. And that is this, so that I think is probably, if the war doesn't escalate, it's probably how the war will end. There will be a deal, there will be a partition. The question will be what are the borders, where they are, but it won't include retaking Crimea. It's not going to happen. And probably it's not going to escalate either. The danger then, of course, and people point this out, and I think they're right, the danger is if Putin gets at least part of what he wants now, then he or some subsequent Russian leader will think they can have a go in the Baltic states and other parts of Europe. So just in this situation, half tragic, half absurd. And whatever's done now, I mean, this is where it's tragic, will involve terrible losses. Now, there is a type of liberalism which says, well, that's exactly what we don't want. What we want is a world in which we don't have to take these tragic choices, in which there aren't such tragic choices. My view, which is there will always be such a world because it reflects the nature of human beings. Human beings have conflicting needs, conflicting desires, conflicting values, not only between one individual or group and other individuals, within each group and within each individual. That's just the way we are. And some of the best features of human beings, some of the noblest sacrifices and noblest resistance of human beings comes from that feature of human beings. And so I've used Hobbes here, where Hobbes, get back to Hobbes, because I think the choice between some kind of authoritarian or even tyrannical regime and anarchy or a failed state is a real one in many parts of the world, including even parts of the West. I mean, if Trump comes back to power in America, there'll be many reasons for that. We could discuss those later, but one reason would be that enough of the American population feels insecure economically. And in other ways, you could say, well, this will be a more authoritarian regime. And say, well, I don't care. So, if it gives me what I want, of course, they may be deluded. They may have no intention of giving them what they want. But if they have a chance of greater security, or believe they have a chance of greater security, if they just have a perception that they might have under Trump, they may be willing to take the gamble on Trump a second time, even after seeing what Trump did when he was in office.
Can we talk a little bit more then about what that new world order, if you like, will look like if we accept that the sort of the liberal West's stated quest for universal democracy leading to universal peace, if that has to be abandoned?
It's over.
So what does the new world look like?
Well, a world of blocks and swing states. What's re-emerged is something like, not like the 1930s, yet at least. Hopefully it won't become as bad as that, but it could. But more like the world before the First World War. Before the First World War, there were a variety of empires in the world and a variety of big states in the world. Russia, Britain, Germany, America was on the sidelines, but already an emerging industrial powerhouse. There were these big states, and no hegemonic power. So what's really happening now, I think, or has already happened, is that the United States remains enormously powerful in hardware military terms. It is still a powerhouse in some technological terms. It's a leader still in some areas of technology where China hasn't caught up. But it's really already ceded any hegemonic control or power over Latin America and the Middle East. I mean, what's happening in the Middle East is that Saudi Arabia and Israel and others are forming new alliances which take precedence over those with America and involve various understandings with China. And similarly, China has expanded to a great degree in Latin America and in Africa. Even French power in Africa has collapsed in Mali and other parts of Africa. So it's in many ways a post-American world. America remains the biggest of the big powers. I mean, even though the economy might now be slightly shorter on some measures that are all rather vague, indefinite measures than the Chinese economy. And even though the Chinese economy is now definitely in trouble, debt, a catastrophic error was made by Xi over COVID, went on much too long, was much too severe. Even though some in the West took it as a model of how we should react, it's had deep damaging effects on China. And there are these debt problems affecting the property market and huge levels of youth unemployment, by the way, almost like or worse even than in Western countries like Britain. I mean, officially about 20%. Some people think that if it's measured by people staying at home and not doing not having, might be twice that. So colossal levels of youth unemployment and of inequality. So they've got these very severe China internal problems, which they're struggling with as Western countries do. But they are continuing to make strides in technology. They're continuing to, they have a huge quantities of capital invested in various parts of the world. And this might be an important point because this is not the new Cold War. One of the most misleading sort of bits of sort of midwittery, which goes into the new Cold War. It's not the new Cold War. In the old Cold War, the actual Cold War that ended in the 90s, the early 90s, 1991, the former Soviet Union had very little direct involvement with Western economies. Western economies are now codependent with the Chinese economy. So that makes it a much more intractable conflict. It's not something that actually can be won in the way that the Cold War was run. So that's another projection of the past into the future. That past is gone forever. That past is irretrievable. But also, given that the American economy is in many ways codependent with the Chinese economy, Tesla and Apple are both semi-Chinese companies, got huge productive facilities there. America imports large sections of its medical supplies from China, antibiotics, and things like that. The idea that is like the Cold War in the sense that it's a conflict that can be won by America, I think it's a complete illusion. There can be China is in many ways. I mean, I think it is a threat to Western countries, including Britain. There is espionage. There's no doubt about that. These are real threats. But the idea that it can be defeated or destroyed as a state or a regime is for the birds. I mean, if the Chinese economy did implode the way the Soviet economy, the post-Soviet economy imploded after communism, the result would be completely catastrophic for the rest of the world economy. Whereas when the post-communist Russian economy imploded, didn't mean much at all for the rest of the world. It would be utter catastrophe for the world if that happened. Then we would be in the 30s. We'd be in the 30s in the sense that there'd be millions of unemployed. Australia, which depends on Chinese mining and commodity prices, etc., would be in disastrous shape. America, insofar it was codependent with China, would be a disaster. So that's not the way forward. And if it were to happen, I don't think it probably will happen, but it would be a complete disaster.
Let's turn to politics domestically.
Yes.
In your writings, not just actually in the book, The New Leviathans,
but also New Statesman.
Yeah, your New Statesman writing as well.
Where, by the way, I have a fortnightly column now. Just
wonderful. Plug it all the time. It becomes evident, though, that liberal democracy is sort of faced with two threats: populism and either alt-liberalism or hyper-liberalism. Call it what you will. First of all, let's start with populism. How do you define populism, and where do you see it in British politics?
Well, I define them as being into hyperliberalism or neoliberalism, which can have more or less extreme forms, as being interrelated or complementary, or as some people used to dialectically. So what liberals call populism is the political backlash against the social disruption produced by their policies, which liberals don't understand or deny. That's what populism is this year. I'm seeing David Cameron. Why did this? Oh, it's populism. Well, where did it come from? Where did it come from? The devil? Was it just solely whipped up by a few demagogues? I mean, there have been demagogues throughout the last 30, 40, 50 years, forever. Why did they start attracting popular support? Why did voters start supporting them? The reason, I think, was that the type of liberalism that prevailed after the end of the Cold War was a kind of narrow, shallow type of market liberalism, which hadn't learned the lessons that liberals and social democrats of earlier generations learned after the Second World War. After the Second World War, all of Western Europe, including Britain, adopted forms of social democracy and government intervention with the aim of preventing another Great Depression. The people who were around there had either lived themselves directly through that depression. They knew that capitalism was a fragile system and prone to booms and busts. So they thought that a whole range of measures, welfare measures, financial measures, fiscal, all kinds of policies needed to be implemented by governments to prevent that happening again. And so in Western Europe, at least, you had 30 years of peace and stability. That lesson was forgotten at the end of the Cold War, or repressed at the end of the Cold War. The idea then was that you could set up a system of rules, central banks would be given independence, they would apply these rules, and the system would be self-stabilizing. And if there were losers in this, and it would be, of course, by then, from globalization was advancing, it was a much more open system than the post-Second World War system had been. So there was a global competition for some kinds of wage labor and wages of particular parts, manual workers and others, and particular regions suffered badly in this. And in America, large parts of the middle class experienced no growth in incomes, or hardly any, or even falls in incomes, during 30 years in which the whole society got richer, taken if you measure it all. So some people were getting that, but not parts of the middle classes. And other parts of the population were completely abandoned because production was offshored. So if you're working in a factory and the facility, the production facilities of the factory were offshored into China or the Philippines or somewhere, then of course the wages there would be much lower for a long time, and you would just become unemployed, and you'd become more or less permanently unemployed. So it was from that what liberals call populism emerged. Liberals think of populism as a sort of mixture of malevolence and stupidity. The malevolence are these wicked politicians. I don't deny that. I mean, Trump is like this, for one. There are many examples in Europe. There are politicians hanging about in the background, always there, who will exploit this. But what they're exploiting is something they did not themselves create. That's why they didn't have any influence, or hardly any influence, in the 1960s, say. For example, now in Germany, I'll come back to Britain in a moment, an example, the AfD, which is a far-right party, has 20% of the vote. For many years, the right-wing parties, the far-right parties in Germany were kept beneath the level. I think it was 4%. There was a level below which they couldn't go without triggering various responses. They were 2%, 3%. Why did that happen? Was it that the demagogues got cleverer, more demagogic, more wicked, more evil? No, they remained exactly as they'd been all along. It means that various problems, various real-life situations to do with economic and other kinds of security became more grave as a result of liberal overreach, as a result of that kind of the liberalism of that. So they're really I mean, in this country, I did a broadcast on BBC Radio, and even before that, I did an early podcast kind of thing in America, saying that there would be a referendum on Britain's membership of the European Union, and I believed then that the result would be leave, and that was a very off-the-wall kind of view at that time. But the reason I believed that was that policies that had been pursued up to that point had left large parts of the country and large parts of the population in stagnant or even declining or even despairing conditions. So I thought that that would be taken. I thought that the Brexit opportunity, which from Cameron's and the Conservative point of view and the point of view of Remainers should never have happened. I mean, that was a mistake on his part, would result in the result that it did do, but not because, and this is one feature of that debate that I very much disliked, not because masses of the population were stupid or racist or had been misled by Nigel Farage. No doubt all of those, or because the Russians had intervened in some sinister way, and no doubt they did. But it wasn't for any of those reasons. It was because large sections of the population who were not doing well or even doing badly believed correctly that they weren't being listened to, that no one was listening, and that no one would listen unless there was a big upheaval. The upheaval in Britain was Brexit. In America, it was Trump. So I wasn't surprised by either of those debates, of either of those results. In fact, I expected both of them for a kind of simple intuition. There were large enough sections of society that did not want and even feared and dreaded a continuation of the status quo. So they were willing to take a gamble on Brexit, on Trump, even if they didn't trust Trump, even if they disliked or even hated him. It was, and in Britain, even if they didn't know what Brexit really meant, or it was a sufficiently radical upheaval, they felt, to let their voices be heard and for something or other to happen. So I wasn't surprised in either case. So the revival of centrism now, is kind of one of the more entertaining absurdities of back in the age of absurdity now, which is that there are now podcasts, there are newspaper columns, everything sort of was going swimmingly in the 1990s. Everything was going wonderful. Well, I lived through it. It wasn't that wonderful.
The golden age.
It wasn't a golden age. And from that period, lots of other things emerged. The Blair government, which then the Brown governments, which did do some good things and did expand welfare spending, they also had an obsession with house prices, and for them that was almost the core of the economy, and that led, I think, directly and indirectly, to a situation now in which a whole generation of young people can't find any way to live affordably. So the problems of that period were problems that we suffer now were rooted in that period. So the idea that you can unwind it, if only we could have avoided what? We'd have had to avoid the financial crisis of 2008. Where did that come from? Was that from the glorious 90s? I mean, who did that? Who actually was responsible for that? If we'd only avoided that, if we'd only avoided the pandemic, you might say nobody anticipated it. What about the disastrous wars that the West got involved in? If all of that had been avoided, we could actually have an indefinite continuation of the 90s. Things have moved on since then. It's completely empty nostalgism, which shows only one thing: a complete poverty of political thinking. Political thinking, whether it be of the right, or of a new centre, or of the left, or off in some other kind of continuum or spectrum, which engages with the realities that actually now exist, rather than wittering on. I mean, these sort of withered, shriveled cast-offs from that period are now returning, zombie-like, as it were, to tell us that everything would be fine if we could only get back to the centre ground. See, the key thing about the centre ground is that the centre that they represented, first of all, excluded huge parts of the population, parts of the north and coastal towns and others. But it was essentially a political construction at Westminster. It didn't reflect what most most Britons of all ethnicities or different actually wanted. It was something they took a series of Westminster-centric policies and triangulated them, and what came out of that was the centre. So the centre was what? The centre was years and years of austerity. Is that really the centre? Was that the centre? That was adopted by the Conservatives and then by the Liberal Democrats under Clegg, and now seems to be adopted by Starmer's Labour Party. So they say they're tracking. They say we will track Conservative spending policies because we feel that nothing can be done which creates any risk to the currency and to Britain's international position. Now, there is some real reason for that, because we saw what could happen under Truss. That kind of brief, was a kind of right-wing Corbynism, Truss, in economic terms. So we saw what can happen, but actually the Truss phenomenon was more of an epiphany. It revealed the underlying structural and systemic fragility of the British finance system, rather than causing it. And one of the things it revealed was that the pension system, the occupational pension, private pension system, and many public pensions were riddled with complicated derivatives, which, if the lessons of the derivatives are, many of your viewers will know this, complicated financial instruments. So they were riddled with derivatives, pension funds, which enabled them to make profits on the basis that interest rates were very low, even when they could still make profits. But unfortunately, those derivatives were structured so that things would blow up if interest rates rose suddenly and substantially, which they did. So in other words, they were based, these dangerous derivatives, instruments of mass financial destruction, I think a leading American investor, Warren Buffett, called them. They would work only if interest rates remained at roughly the lowest level they've been for 300 years. But history's not like that. You don't get down, it wouldn't. So it was a catastrophic error, and that was revealed, not caused, revealed by the disastrous Truss experiment. So we are exposed, and it may be that we can't do very much, that this country can't do very much without provoking an attack by the market. It may be that the international flows of international capital have a kind of veto over us now, but that's because of decisions that were made in the 90s. So the 90s are what got us to where we are. They're not a golden era that mad people suddenly, or over a period of time, departed from the golden age and wantonly destroyed it. It's because the seeds of where we are now, the causes of it, were then. So going back, if it was possible, it isn't possible. You just actually have to go through the next 30 years again. It's not going to happen, all of that. But it's a sign of the extreme paucity of political imagination and the extreme poverty of political thinking in this country at the present time.
But this provokes the question then, right? That essentially what these people mean is that the centre is basically what we in Westminster, in the political class,
think it is. Believe it to be.
Yeah, this is what we view as acceptable. This, and in
anything outside that's not the centre.
Looking at recent history, it's essentially technocracy, it's austerity, and as you pointed out with the Labour Party, whereas populism, for example, could mean, nationalising
utility.
Significant.
It did mean that. I mean, left-wing Corbynite populism. I'm a strong opponent of Corbyn and remain so on the ground of his toleration of or kind of blind eye turned to anti-Semitism in the party, but also his constant attempts to whitewash Russia. I mean, I think just when he cast doubt on the Russian involvement in the murders in Salisbury, it was a terrible moment for Labour. But in his economic policies, he was very popular. And there is an undoubted and overwhelming majority in this country for taking utilities back into some public ownership, which I would strongly support if it was possible. Or if it is possible. I think it could be made possible by cutting other things. If HS2 had been cut long ago, or was even cut now, if one or two other things were done, maybe water at least could be taken back. It would be a total scandal, a national disgrace, being a predatory rip-off by shareholders and management, and inadequate or catastrophically low investment. Even some of the foul-ups at airports recently come about because of a partial privatization of air traffic control, and then taking out of large dividends. So these are types of, and of course some solid businesses have been damaged by vulture capitalism, taking them over like Boots was taken over, supermarket Morrison's, and then loaded with debt, and then they extract some of the capital and leave it half dead. So all these types of capitalism are under the mechanical extension of privatization to areas where it should never have been extended. I think there's a strong, durable, large, and undoubted popular majority in favor of that, 60 or 70. I mean, I think even conservative voters, it's in excess of 50% who favor renationalization. So why is that not in centrism? Westminster centrism is what have we got to do? We've got to cut down spending. We've got to have fiscal orthodoxy. We've got to have this. We've got to have that. Where is that there? It's overwhelming. That's not that central British view, the view of people of different ethnicities, different classes, different opinions in other respects, different parties, etc., is that these public utilities should be taken back into public ownership. And that's represented as an extreme view. It wasn't extreme for generations, and it isn't extreme now. It's very sensible. Whether it's possible, sadly, is not clear, because it could cost a lot if you try to renationalize all of them. But something could be done. Some of the most grievous aspects of privatization could be undone, I'm sure. And yet Labour isn't doing that. It's pursuing its centrism by excluding, the way Cameron and Osborne did, policies that a large, strong British majority undoubtedly favours. They never even get discussed. They're hardly raised at all. So I think that's but it won't hold, because we don't know what's going to happen at the next election. It's been changed by events in Scotland, in which the Scottish National Party, I think, has lost, probably for a generation or forever, its dominant role in Scottish politics. Other nationalist parties may expand and take over, but basically Labour's likely to have a comeback at the next election, and that could enable it to have a working majority in Parliament. But if it does have a working majority in Parliament, it will face enormous problems of a possible Trump administration. How will they react to that?
When your foreign secretary has literally been out, years past, protesting and saying all these crazy things.
Yeah, saying, and Starmer has also said, I mean, they're taking a big bet on Trump not getting back.
Yeah.
They're taking a big bet on, if not Trump, then on some other Trump-like leader not getting back. It is a very big bet, and it's a near bet too. We're talking about a year or a year and a half, less than a year and a half. We'll know. And even if the Democrats, whether in the form of a very old Biden or some successor, win the next American presidential election, even if that does happen, America is going to be deeply preoccupied with its own affairs, because my one firm prediction about the American election is not about who will win. I think it's impossible to say at this point, but it's that whoever wins will be regarded as illegitimate by about a third or more of the American population. In other words, you're in a crisis of legitimacy in America, whoever wins. And so they'll be focused on themselves. They'll be trying to work that out. There's a danger of, not of civil war like in the 19th century, but of civil warfare, of that they just lose the capacity of complete gridlock in Washington, lose the capacity to have a proper functioning state. So it becomes a sort of semi-failed state. And in those circumstances, the rest of the world, Europe and so on, especially Europe, will have to look after itself. So you could have another financial crisis, you could have a Wall Street crash, you could have all kinds of things, are realistic possibilities, even if global geopolitics doesn't get more lively, so to speak, by some kind of Chinese action on Taiwan, which would change the whole world, of course, not only because of what happened in Taiwan, but because of the Taiwanese production of computer chips and the fact that a huge part of world shipping passes through the China state. So these are all coming. How will a policy based on reviving the 90s, which actually with a few tweaks here and there, the Starmer Rachel Reeves' policies, basically of strengthening the post-Cold War neoliberal order. I mean, they've said, Reeves has said, to give her credit, she said, with globalization of the old form is over, we've got to have security, we've got to have securonomics, and what she called it. But how can that be achieved within a framework of rigid fiscal orthodoxy and of not being ready to look at different ways of organizing utilities, different ways? How can it be achieved how can securonomics, if there is such a thing, to be implemented within the frameworks of the 90s, which is essentially what she's still doing? So I think this is a fundamental error, and it will break down quite quickly, because whatever happens globally and we are very exposed, we're a kind of mid-ranking power. America can, to some extent, close itself off. It's autarkic. It's got now many energy sources. It can focus on itself. It can become introverted. We can't. We're not a small power. We're a relatively large economy still, but we can't just ignore these huge global forces. How will this? I predict it'll be blown away. Or at least its policies will be. Final point. In this respect, we're talking about the utilities and public services and so on. We've had long periods in the health service, in the railways, and other parts of the public sector. Long periods of strikes. Will these go away under Labour? Will people say, well, Labour's? I don't think so at all. I think the public sector unions will regard Labour as being as obstructive to their goals and their well-being and their incomes and so on as they've regarded the Conservatives. So those strikes will go on unless there are substantial pay deals. And if there are substantial pay deals, how can that be achieved while respecting these supposedly inviolable limits that Rachel Reeves and Keir? They can't be. So it will break down. They'll either yield Labour in power to these demands, and then break the fiscal, and then there would be the danger of some kind of rerun of what happened under Truss, or they will try to hold the line, and you'll be in a more or less permanent state, like in the 1970s, of chronic industrial conflict. So I don't see how it can work.
Let's talk about the other side of the equation that I set up earlier then, opposite populism, hyperliberalism, which you've recently written and described as a, quote, threat.
Yeah.
The progressive left, alt liberalism, hyperliberalism, call it what you will. First of all, could I ask you for a definition of terms? And then whether or not, we've just been talking about Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, who embodies it in public life? Do you view them as a part of it? Are they more of a neoliberal? And why do you think hyperliberalism is a threat?
Well, things blur into each other. So, I would say progressive liberalism in Britain and America has increasingly been a political project pursued outside of the normal political process. So in America, for example, at the moment, I think this is a fatal weakness, a fatal error on the part of the American left. The aim is as much to destroy Trump legally through lawsuits, through lawfare, as it is to defeat him in the public sphere of democratic debate. And one of the things that the progressive left, let's call it, has done, which I would distinguish from the old Labour left or the Woodrow Wilson left or the post-Second World War left of the past, has been to embody their values and their positions in laws, which basically then can only be challenged in the courts. So they've sort of abstained from. By the way, I wrote back in the 1990s, it's in my new book, New Leviathans, passage where I said that in the case of America, I could see America drifting into a position of deep, insoluble internal conflict by its legalism, which was then embodied in philosophies such as that of John Rawls or Ronald Dworkin. Basically, the idea was you come up with almost an ideal constitution of liberties, and which are kind of all dovetail, they don't conflict with each other. You set those in place, and politics is what's left over. Well, first of all, basic freedoms don't dovetail. They're often disharmonious with one another. I want free speech. I want to be able to say what I can say, but I don't want to be targeted by hate speech either. So that's a conflict, and the conflict is rooted in something real, which is that we all have real interests which are conflict with each other. So the aim of politics is to get some kind of reasonable balance. We shift over time in that. But if you embed some political position as an unalterable right, then what then happens is the politicization of the law. And I thought if America came undone, it would be over abortion. I'm a pro-choice on abortion, so I would be a liberal on this. But I thought if once it was constitutionalized, the inevitable result would be that over time, opponents of that position would take over the judicial institutions, which they did under Trump. When I said that 30 years ago, I absolutely thought I was crazed because they assumed that the judicial institutions would be run by liberals. Well, it's not an eternal truth, and now we found that he stacked the court in the United States with there's now a non-liberal majority. So what happened over abortion could happen over gay marriage, could happen even over contraception. It could be all of these things could happen. And then you're in a very difficult situation because politics has been displaced into law. The law has been politicized, and since rights are normally on or off, you either have them or you don't. They've been framed in such a way that there's not much room for compromise. You have a deadly conflict then, actually, one which can very hard to resolve at all. So that's progressive liberalism. Hyperliberalism, I suppose, is the idea that each individual or each group should be free to define itself as it pleases. In other words, you can say, I'm not this, I'm that. Really. Human identities could be made up as you go along. And of course, what I say in the new book is that, Hobbes was sort of kind of aware of this in a way, because what he did see that words could be weapons. And one of the features of the hyperliberal period that we're now in is a tremendous conflict, an attempt to control language. Very interesting kind of control language. Certain expressions are forbidden. Now, there's some reason for that. After all, there have been laws in this country against racism, against hatred for a long time. In fact, practically all liberal democracies that still exist in one form or another, except America, maybe one or two, but they all have them. Every European, pretty well, maybe I'm not sure about Denmark, but pretty well everybody have these. So these are normal and long predate. But if you extend them to cover more and more different topics, if they become more and more, then there's a danger that what was originally intended as a restriction, curbs on racist and other hate speech become ways of even smothering anything that's deemed offensive. So you can have jokes can be offensive, not because they're just offensive to some kind of sentiment. And I think the danger of that is for it to become very censorious, but also it becomes a kind of competition in who's the most offended.
Can that be as much of a threat, though, as that which is posed by populism in the way that you've just described? Do you think they're on an equal footing? Do you view hyperliberalism as more of a threat than the populist one?
Well, they're different because the populists, in a sense, who, as I've discussed earlier on, I think are really, populism is largely created in its present form by hyperliberalism or progressive liberalism. But they're different because the interesting thing is the populists do want power. They do want to use the state to promote their goals, whereas liberals and hyperliberals, actually, interestingly enough, they haven't had that much power the hyperliberal forms of cancellation and censorship are actually self-imposed. It's not the government, whether it's conservative or not. It's not Joe Biden who's going around shutting places down and so on. It's actually civil society. It's actually deciding to police themselves, and that's something that I think people should understand more than they do, because the result of it is not actually an authoritarian state. That could come from various forms of populism, for example. But it's more of a sort of fragmented and fractured society which is unable to do anything. It's a different model. Actually, it's more like a Hobbesian state, a kind of not necessarily violent, but a Hobbesian state of nature of a different kind, which each group is struggling with other groups over public resources or particular institutions that might not even be public, might be private, which for resources and status and as well. So they're really, in many ways, although they're reciprocally related, dialectically related, populism and hyperliberalism are different in that respect. The normal result of hyperliberalism is weak states, weak governments, not able to do anything. And that, I think, is more like the case in Britain now, because whatever you think about what ought to be done, should more houses be built, or to alleviate problems of younger generations having nowhere to buy, or not, it's actually very difficult to implement a policy because it'll be challenged immediately in the courts. In other words, one of the features of this progressive anti-liberalism is to move decision-making out of the sphere of government, things that governments can just decide, and into NGOs or legal processes. So the government decides we'll print more, we'll build more houses, try and do it. It's immediately blocked. Now, you might say, well, that's good on environmental or grounds, but it does mean that nothing ever happens. It does mean that it's very different, and it does mean even that, even if HS2 is cancelled, which I hope it is, a tremendous waste of money, there might be a plethora of lawsuits emerging from that. People who say that we've had these contracts, we've blah, blah, blah. It take forever to cancel it. Might never be cancelled, actually. So you get into a position of paralysis, and that's quite different from what the populists are. We haven't yet had a fully populist government anywhere in Europe. I suppose we did in America with Trump. There was in America with Trump for a while. Although if he does have a second run, I think he'll be more radical than he was then. Not because he thought about it at all, but because he'll want to get revenge on his enemies, and he'll make a bonfire of international treaties. He'll do all kinds of things that he wanted to do the first time and or might be able to do now. But what would happen if there were a full scale? What would happen if, for example, it's quite conceivable in Europe now, if Marine Le Pen, won the next presidential election? That would be interesting, wouldn't it? It'd be terrifying as well, but it would be interesting because remember, she got over 40% of the vote. Not 2%, and it was actually a lot of young people voted for her as well. But why did they vote for her? Not because they're Nazis or because they have the least to lose by that. They don't have large savings. They don't have long careers. They live in a position of precariousness. So they have the least to lose. There could easily be, contrary to in Britain, large sections of European young people vote for far-right parties, even populist parties. Why is that? Because they're suffering from the downsides of neoliberal economics and neoliberal market policy, market liberalism. That's why.
John Gray, we've run out of time.
That's fine. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming in. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
New Leviathans, out now. Thank you.
Thank you very much.